So, see, I remember you mentioned to me about something called race-based coping. Would you mind to explain a little this concept to us?
Sure. So this concept we talked about earlier this year at an event that my colleague Nicole Mantlo and I ran with our Schemex collective. And the event was on racial trauma and the idea that racism and experiences of oppression lead to schema development. And it makes sense, right? Because that's the kind of the social context in which the attachment bond is formed, how the family of origin is marinated in, as well as the kind of the peer group, but also the society at large. So there's this wonderful British schema therapist called Lorraine Gordon, who is so she's a Black British therapist, and she talks about this idea of race-based coping, where these schemas are developed in the, it's like in the crucible of oppression. And in one of the discussions she had, she used this example of so think of this scenario. There's two mothers talking about their kids, right? So there's a Black mom and a white mom, and then their kids are just next to them. They can overhear the conversation, and so the Black mom is saying to the white mom, "Oh wow, your son is so smart. He's doing so well. He's doing great in tennis and blah blah blah, and you must be so proud of him." And the white mom saying, "Oh yes, we're so happy with him. Like he's doing so fantastic, and we're really proud. And he's gonna, he's gonna do this and that. And your dad's so proud. Grandparents are so proud." And then the white mom takes a pause and said to the Black mom, "How about your kid? He's doing fantastic. He's, doing great at sports. He's, graduating top of his class." And the Black mom goes, "Oh no, no, he's just he's driving me crazy. He's no good." Right. And so with the kids hearing this, I think a lot of like Asian kids would be laughing because they're like, well, that also happens in Asian families as well, right? And so, their kids are hearing this, right? They overhearing one mom being very overtly proud and the other mom, being very critical, right? And so in this, in this discussion, they rewind it. It's like a video. They rewind it, and it looks back in kind of the slavery age, right? And so it's, the Black mom is at a plantation, and a white slave owner comes up to her and say, "Your son is fantastic. He's really fit. He's so healthy, and he's such a smart boy." And the mom goes, "No, he's not. He's trouble. You don't want him." Because in her mind, she's thinking, "I don't want you to take him. I want to keep my son safe." Right. And so there's a secret. She's holding a secret,
Yeah.
but children don't know the secret. You can't tell them the secret. Right. And by the time they're old enough to know the secret, it's too late. They've been hurt by this. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we obviously this is such an issue with racism and anti-Black sentiments in Asia as well. But when we talk about how this affects cultures where there's a lot of trauma, when there's been a lot of war, a lot of poverty, a lot of issues around survival, we can start to think about why some of these schemas have developed. Right? Well, one can argue that all schemas are developed out of trauma, and that's to some extent true. But when you have these global, like, kind of like cultural level, historical, traumatic events, you can have more people developing what look like personality disorders, right? And so when you start to think a majority of the population have personality disorders, then there's no longer personality disorder because it's all about something being kind of beyond the norm, right? So that's, I think, where we can start to over pathologize certain cultural, certain behaviors.
Yeah. And when that schema have a function, that's what I heard from your story, right? When that schema develop because some kind of behavior that's actually protective in that
Yes.
context, in that
Yeah.
time, that 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 becomes something different. You can't take away someone's coping mechanism without
Yes.
making them safe.
Yeah. And so I think, it's really important to understand, the motivation around these behaviors, especially when we do any imagery, any challenging of the critics, how we approach them, how we can be very nuanced and subtle around, when you challenge a critic, I think, I mentioned, this, maybe we'll talk about it a bit later as well, but this idea, I did one imagery scripting when in the image, I said to the critic, did you leave China and sacrifice your whole life so that your kid can feel so guilty and miserable? Is this what you did all of that for? Right? And so that's really different, as opposed to saying, this is the way you're treating is not acceptable. Like, you can't
Yeah,
be so harsh on her. She's just a kid. Like, all of those
yeah,
things are true, but understanding the motivation of why the parents were so harsh, and why the parents were so desperate is
yeah,
important.
yeah. And you will remind that critics, you remind her about her intention, because
Yes.
that's a function of that critics. And you remind her, you even can thank her for doing so, but seeing the effect of it right now, is that really what you want? So
Yes, that's right.
yeah, you're almost like befriending that critics rather than
Yeah.
confronting it.
Yeah. And you can, even say, like, your job is done.
Yes,
It's time.
yes,
Time to
yes,
let it go, right? Can
yes,
you let it go or something like that, right? Or you teach the critic how to let it go, right? Because
yes,
often, as we said, some of them don't have the skills, right? They just don't know how to do this, and they have experienced so much of their own trauma. So how do we work with the critic?
yeah, yeah, yeah. In that context, we have to fully understand the intention and normalize it, and thanks for what happened in the past, the protective function of it. But now times may change and it may not need anymore. When you
Yeah,
even have to preach that, how, right? Like, how can they let go, or that critics part can let go?
that's right.
Yeah,
And
but
kind of,
so much detail in it.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the critics itself becomes not just one version, right? It could be multiple manifestation.
That's right. Yes, very nuanced.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we also come across about our culture as Chinese, like the shame-based culture. And how is that, affect the schema or measurement from your perspective?
I think shame is just used so prolifically, and sometimes it can look like a punitive critic, right? Because
Mm.
it's so shaming, it seems so harmful. But the intention of it, again, may be an actually misguided way of trying to motivate the client. So in fact, it's more of like a demanding critic, for example.
Right, right. But it shows up like a primitive.
Yeah, it could. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like very demeaning, very harsh, very
Yeah.
hostile. But the
Ex-
intention itself be would be for survival, or be
That's
right
right.
for, yeah, in the name of love.
Yeah. Like, I just want you to get into a selective school so you can have a good life.
Yes.
But I'm going to
Oh,
shame the hell out of you to do it. They're like,
yeah.
no, mom, it doesn't work.
And for
Or
mom,
it
that's
does
so
work, but
important.
yeah, I was like, it does work and it causes lasting damages.
Yeah, yeah. And for mom, that may be a different story, right? That's like, I have so much anxiety about you not getting into that school. It would mean your future is ruined. It would mean I can protect you from any unexpectancy later if you don't get into this school. This is maybe
Yeah.
the only thing that the mom knows that would be okay to survive in this
Yes.
world. And I want you to be protected. I want you to
Yeah.
walk safe life. Yeah,
So
yeah,
understanding this sort of, mothering, I think, we also talked about this, there's research with Jewish families after the Holocaust, right? There's, that there's a lot more anxious attachment in parenting that shows up. And this makes total sense after experiencing something like the Holocaust. Of course, there's going to be a higher level of anxious attachment showing up, right? And so
yeah,
I think understanding the cultural history and political context where people are coming from, there's a much better understanding of why that attachment style is coming out with it, instead of kind of pathologizing it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And another thing come to my mind is those Chinese concept like 重男輕女, the gender bias, right?
Yes.
It's quite widespread common phenomena, and how men can be, see it as a chauvinist in a positive light. Like they are very well accepted, as long as they are the breadwinner, or they are pretty protective to their family, then they can be quite a chauvinist. They can feel they are more in power, more authority. And what they said is more than what other people said. This is so well accepted. And it's
Yeah.
closely related to gender bias.
Yeah, and it's so much part of Confucian philosophy, right? This idea of that hierarchy of, men being above women, being, and and within the state being above all of that. So yeah, it's so built in within philosophy.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And how women in the traditional Chinese history or culture or philosophy, like the woman is supposed to be accommodating, supposed to be more obedient, supposed to
Yeah.
follow.
And I see
Yeah.
this so much with and in fact, actually almost I would say like majority of the clients that my supervisors bring to me from China and Hong Kong, the female clients, all experience this within the home. Like I remember one case of this client in an imagery scripting, like she talked about how her own mother would make all this delicious food and give meat and eggs to her brother, but then she would just be like, eat whatever
Mm,
is there, the daughter.
mm,
This
mm,
level of oppression is so incredibly in part of the culture, and yet because a lot of people who within the culture who may not agree because they see some strong women, they're like, oh look, women can be strong and loud, therefore sexism doesn't exist, right? And but what happens is, I think there's this kind of this level of experience which called in Chinese it's what, right? And we said like it's hard to translate into English. It's like, it's not just for women. It's, the feeling of, I think it more or less translates to oppression, right? There's this feeling of being misunderstood. There's a feeling of being subjugated. There's a sense of unfairness. It can be
yeah.
very systemic.
Yes. Yes, yes, that's so true. That's so true. There's no direct translation in English that for that word. And it's so much into the context that this is what's supposed to be.
Yeah. And you
Yeah.
and you don't question it, the role of it. And I think again, it happens within every culture, but it's quite intense, right? It's very
Yeah.
much part of it.
And it cultivate a lot of submissiveness, right?
Yes.
Like you follow and almost like your reward for it. This is good. This is what supposed to be. And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So when we talk about a healthy adult male who is mature, taking responsibility and autonomy, this is not quite practiced if we
No.
cultivate that submissiveness.
And it's seen also even in supervisees. I've had supervisees who say, like, when they, in trainings, they feel really uncomfortable raising their voice, talking about what things that they're interested in, to challenge the trainer and things like that. And so I think for therapists, for them to be able to challenge the critic modes in therapy is also a challenge if they're so used to, taking on that submissive role.
Exactly, exactly. That's why the empathetic confrontation is quite, we need to practice and learn. Is so much anxiety when we apply
Mhm.
it. If
Yes.
I'm very honest, it's so much
Yeah.
anxiety when we apply it too. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And
So you're going to really work on that, the possibility of subjugation, within there, and emotional inhibition that may be part of the kind of embedded within the culture, as well as enmeshment, for therapists to start addressing those schemas within themselves when they want to practice schema therapy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And the experiential elements in the therapy itself is so important because the client cannot feel it in the bigger environment if they are really into, really single culture background, then they probably, are not supported. And that therapy experience is bringing something really new to the brain. So the wire
Yes.
go a new way. Right? Is
Yeah.
this it's something so important, the experiential part.
And so the client really, especially if they're not experiencing this in the culture, as you said, then they really need the therapist to role model how it can be done, right? That how they can actually, respectfully set boundaries and limits with the parents in a way that is aligned with the culture. So really see how it can be done.
Yeah, yeah. And this remind me about one of my supervisee from a British city, because her client is a Chinese background, and she doesn't get um the situation becomes very interesting because I'm trying to listen to what is not said, right? It's
Mm,
not what is told in the session. It's more like what the client didn't say and the therapist didn't pick up. Because
mm,
the shame make you don't want to speak up, right? It's too shameful. I don't want you to see me. And that's so much things unspoken. I want you to know, but I really can't say it. Like the
mm,
guilt about you are mentioning my mom is this and that, how this is not okay. And I immediately overwhelmed by the guilt. I can't
mm,
say anything. This is like part of that part of the overall suppression.
mm,
Um, yeah, I found it quite difficult when to verbally make it explicit to a foreigner. What is this? This is quite difficult. How you have to listen to something that's what's not spoken. You have to
mm.
try to understand what she she may not speak, but what is that she is trying to say, or she's talking at the surface, and what this really means. It is, yeah,
And
yeah.
to get this real attunement, right? Like, we talk about
Yeah,
the need
yeah,
for therapy. It's about attuning to someone's reality, right? And that their reality is different for every person. And so there's a cultural reality people have.
yeah, exactly. And another thing we haven't talked about is the Chinese concept about face, right? 家丑不成外傳, right? You can't tell people about your family issues because if your family do something that's shameful, you should feel shameful. But this is like you are linked, so you don't want to talk. And then you have no way to tell a story, your own story, your version of story.
And it's, and I think that manifests in a real lack of safety, right? A
Yeah,
lot of, especially older generations, there's the assumption of privacy and acceptance is just not there, and there's so much judgment by others.
right.
And I think like it's how we are seen by others is a lens which we see ourselves. That's a sort of a level of cultural enmeshment there is. So if we're seen as bad within our community, we are become bad, right? So that level of social cost is actually really tangible.
Yeah, yeah. When it comes to a question, so, how do you see the enmeshment, as a schema and the relationship of this schema with other schema, like self-sacrifice, like dependency or defectiveness, and, clinically with clients in more collectivistic cultural background? How do you see that?
Well, I think enmeshment, in all cases, it intensifies the schemas, right? It's almost like you've got a schema and enmeshment puts a super pack on it. So you got self-sacrifice, it's like superversion, and dependency, superversion, defectiveness, superversion, right?
Yeah,
So it's almost like the enmeshment is like what makes everything stickier, harder to shift, harder to move. And so it's, again, because it's in the background, it's not always easy to pick up. And I find in a lot of Asian cultures, you have people who are it's not necessarily that they are in and out of each other's lives so much physically, although that can definitely be the case. But there's often this sense of like psychological enmeshment. There's kind of like, I can't be happy because my parents are unhappy,
yeah,
or what they've done for me. I feel so much gratitude and also guilt for them.
yeah. I owe so much.
Yeah, and so, there's a sense of, these kind of that duty and everything, they're personally bound within the culture. And so, yeah, there's a kind of a qualitative difference almost.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it, the qualitative difference. Yeah, if we
Mm.
think about those psychological terms like diffusion, like this is a concept and you have to diffuse from it. But when it comes to a schema, It is not just a thought that you're diffusing. It's almost like part of you are diffusing.
And it's like cutting off a limb. It's gonna hurt, and you're
Yeah,
gonna lose something very real, right?
exactly. 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 And with all this understanding, including like how love shows up in family within our culture, and what's the balance of setting boundaries, you would say?
Well, I think because it doesn't promote direct communication, um, there's for example, in imagery scripting, instead of saying things like, "Oh, now can you see your parents saying I love you?" Like that's just not believable.
It
You know,
won't happen.
I know even the words like "oh oile" just feels like awkward.
Yeah,
It's just like
okay,
don't say
okay.
that. Yeah, like exactly. It's like I get like weird goosebumps. And even in movies, you don't hear it, so
Exactly.
it's not. But what we can play with is something that is maybe more an inhibited way of showing love, which be seen as like a lesser version of love, but is actually a very important one. So because it's different in the cultural context. So I would play with things like, can you see your dad cutting watermelon for you? It's your favorite
Mm,
fruit.
mm, mm.
Do this Doraemon shape that you love, and he's putting the eye especially there, and he's
Yeah,
just making it just right. Can you see how carefully he's doing it? And he's got a smile on his face when he's saying that, when he's doing this, and it's a smile of how proud he is of his kid,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
kind of more like it's more believable.
yeah, yeah, yeah. All those non-verbal expression.
Yeah, and the
Yeah,
love language is often like around food or things that they do for each
yeah.
other. Yeah, so kind of, and also you can play with it, like your parents having a smile of acceptance, right? Instead of giving you a big hug and say yes, whatever,
Right, right. Yeah, 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 yeah. And yeah, that's so much more attuned to the client
Yeah.
with all
So
this
and,
direct
and
question.
yeah, and I think again, kind of working within context of what the client really needs. If the client wants to separate from the family, sure, but I think yeah, kind of more subtle ways of showing love that is more culturally appropriate is important.
Yeah, yeah. It's like this is the part of your advice to schema therapists handling the enmeshment schema with clients
Mm.
that are more collectivistic background.
Yeah, yeah. And you can ask your clients like, how, instead of saying, how would you like your parents to show you love? Which I think especially a lot of, people nowadays, because of globalization, we've watched the movies, we've watched the Hollywood movies where the parents have this effusive way of demonstrating love. And so sometimes clients would crave that. And I've heard even
Yeah,
people in China wanting their parents to say I love you and whatnot, but when they do it, it may or may not be believable, right?
right.
So kind of talk about like finding ways in which the clients, should, when is a time when you continue and your parents were proud of you, may or may not exist, but but kind of working within what feels more culturally acceptable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm aware that when you talk about it, I would also be more, reserved, like, yeah, it's like more the suppressive side of me would come out.
Yeah,
Almost like
yeah, I'm more like kind of subdued and yeah, definitely not like this.
Yes, like you almost want to speak lower, softer, and so yeah, 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 yeah. You really speak to me. And so, what would you how to work with those people that is like migrants? Like they bring their kids to now it happens everywhere in the world now. Like people from mainland China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, they're moving all over the world. So how would you
Yeah.
want to deal with them?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, what we're saying is that it's not that the clients cannot voice disagreement. We cannot voice disagreement. Absolutely not. We need to help challenge cultural assumptions, right? But to challenge cultural assumptions that keeps the client stuck, we need to be able to do it by knowing the cultural assumptions. We can't just kind of randomly challenge them, right? So it's like working in the UN or like international relations. We need diplomacy in dealing with the critics, and we need to have cultural knowledge when we want to have diplomacy, right? So One thing about, not focusing on the deficit model is important. While we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, focusing on, talking about intergenerational resilience is really important. Talking about, what is beneficial about having a culture where you kind of look after each other, right? It's not all bad. Like, there are versions of it that's, problematic, but this idea of kind of caring for each other means that, like I use an early example of a trans client who, they're really struggling with accessing gender affirming care. But the fact is that even though their parents are so against it, they are, more than willing to continue to financially support their child, right? To
Yeah,
actually look
yeah,
after
yeah,
their time
yeah,
of need. Right. And so there's so much more of this kind of like caring for each other, even if you vehemently disagree with each other. You don't just kind of cut each other out. Obviously, that can happen. I'm not saying it's not possible. So kind of understanding that there is resilience in this way of being as well. And also in finding tension between holding the parents' sacrifice and their own needs. So it's not always easy, but kind of finding that space and understanding that that often it's a real challenge if the client refuses to help. Where do the parents go for support? So it's almost kind of like the client may actually need to engage in more levels of helping the parents help themselves, right? So
yeah,
that look like, and then knowing that if they step away, the parents are going to be okay as well. But they may need to kind of build some of that scaffolding, which if your parents speak English, you just don't have to do that, right?
yeah.
Yeah, so I think, and again, a big part of it is, how do we challenge the critics? Like I said earlier, like how do we talk, understanding the intentions, right? Can really help.
Yeah, yeah. I think you point out something really important here, the intergeneration resilience. If we see something positive from that culture, we can be more acceptive to those, let's put it like deficits or, the downside of it, where we can
Yeah.
have more space and allowance for it.
And also, I think if you, actually, this is an example I had with a client where we were talking about, challenging cultural norms, and I had said to them this idea of like, maybe we can borrow from Western ideas around setting boundaries and challenging within our own culture and borrow some of that kind of individualistic idea. And my clients schooled me and said actually found within their own culture stories of people who were really like rebels who actually fought against their own culture to kind of because of values, because of things that they cared about. And I just love that finding stories within your own culture that can actually
Definitely.
promote is so helpful. And I think I saw this graph a while back, which I struggled to find again, that compare the Confucius philosophy to Buddhism. And main idea of it was that the Buddha actually separated from his own family, right?
Yeah,
Actually stepped away from his family in order to access enlightenment, right?
yes,
And so stories like this can actually be used as evidence for when there's something that we really care about.
yes,
It's
yes.
okay to step away. It's
Yeah.
okay to step away for what we feel really, really important about.
Right, right. That's a super good example. I'm going to remember it.
Yeah, I hope I find that graph
Yeah.
again. I saw it once and then it's gone. I'll have to look for it again.
Yeah, yeah, but that's a super example. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing. And I remember you have write poems, which I found it really lovely. Yeah, I would, definitely. Would you mind to read it out so we can
Oh.
have it read and listened to?
So yeah, it's a poem about enmeshment, which is perfect. And I wrote a zine, which is here, called Noodles and Neuroses. And it's a collection of writings about schema therapy, family ties, and queer love. And there's and there's a poem about called Love Languages, which is about immigrant mothers, but really about enmeshment, which can apply for a lot of people. So I'll read it. Love languages. She came and fed me with an urgency, till I burst at the seams and exploded in rage. Migrant mothers whose love language is self-sacrifice, whose love is a verb, a meal that once cost a week in wages in a country far away. But I'm the generation who buys meals wrapped in plastic available at every supermarket. Migrant mothers whose love language is forever. She will never leave me, but cling on for dear life, and remembers nothing about me, except for the memories of me that I have long forgotten. Migrant mothers whose love language is death. She talks of it constantly, as the only currency she understands, as dying is a fairy tale where she finally gets the happy ending she deserves. She knows nothing of the language of intimacy, except the comfort of walking in when I pee. She cares not for who I am or claim to be, because I am genderless. I am a lump of clay to be molded as her protector, as her best friend, as her partner in life. The only one she could ever trust. She knows nothing of the language of space, the space I needed between us so that I can breathe, but the umbilical cord bounds us together so tight that I forget where she ends and I begin. I watch as my white friends hug her and tell me how cute she is. I stand with my hands awkwardly to my side, my love language for her forever stunted. As my hair grays and back aches, I too learn the lesson of mortality, of longing, of closed borders and precious time, to value the love that I needed rather than the love that I wanted, the lesson migrant mothers know too well. The tangle of duty and love is the language of migrants, each generation with a mission to complete, not crossing paths, not connecting on shared dreams, but dreaming to be better than the past.
Thank you for sharing. It's beautifully written.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think, this is it's gonna, for me, it gonna really speaks to that sense of, our body's not belonging to us, that we're a lump of clay that is molded, right? It's yeah, it's a complex relationship.
Yeah. And there's so much to explore and learn, even within the collectivistic culture, right? There's still a lot differences, small differences in different
Mhm.
people and family.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and sometimes, with for client group that I work with, sometimes it's even harder to create that separation, right? To be different to the norm, because within the collectivist culture, there's such pressure to conform, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And thanks so much, C, for all the sharing today and sharing with your wisdoms, your learnings, observations. And I wish we have this conversation keep going.
I hope so too. Maybe we'll do round two.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
I